Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today we are speaking with Richard FrancisJones. He is a highly awarded practicing Australian architect. He is a graduate of Columbia University in New York and the University of Sydney and has taught in many schools of architecture. He is a Life Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects, an Honorary Fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He is Design Director of FJMtstudio. We're having him on today to speak about his book, In Truth and Lies in Architecture. Unfortunately, I've not been able to read the book before interviewing Richard, which would be kind of standard practice, but I've been able to review lightly the book, and there's some very interesting takes on truth and architecture and design and practice and theory that I want to dig into. So let me not yammer on forever, and let's talk to Richard. Richard FrancisJones, correct?
Correct.
Get it? Double last name. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to read your book before this interview, but I was able to look over kind of the summary and some points of it that I thought were very thought-provoking and might actually convince me to read a book. I have a hard time reading. I'm always listening to things. So is there an audio version available?
Not yet. No. Maybe later there will be. But one thing about the book is it's like a series of little essays that are kind of related. So each one
I could do that.
You can get one. You know, you could do one in 20 minutes.
Nice. Well, definitely, I'll need to get a copy of that. Regardless, it sounds like a good read, especially from the subject matter I'm seeing in this summary of it. I have some definitions I'd like to get from you for like a clarity to then compare against some of your statements from the summary as discussion points.
Mm-hmm.
So, to start out, what is your definition of architecture?
Well, that's a really big question. I think I do try to differentiate between architecture and building. And I think that is perhaps helpful in understanding what architecture is. Architecture is where you imbue in building something other than the banality, if you like, and the directness of its purpose. And the truth of the matter is, it's actually hard to exclude that. You know, you can build a building that says something unintended, right? Even in its banality, right?
Right.
So I think architecture, in a way, is the poetic content of building.
Okay, I can understand that. I've seen this in my experience. My background's in architecture, so I understand this to a large degree already, but you're able to articulate that in a way that helps me separate the two, architecture and simply shelter and protection. So in Maine, if you get into certain areas that are more inland and very rural, sometimes the old farmhouses and everything else look like there was an idea of proportion and truth and materials and everything else that went into these buildings. And then there's other buildings where you realize that these people wanted quick, low-cost warmth and protection. And those were the only requirements in what they needed from the outside looking at it. But then, you know, all the stuff that I'm in front of shooting and the stuff that I appreciate has this far more poetic experience to it. This far more there's an ideology or a personalization of a person's experience that is shown in how this thing works, is put together, constructed, and how it interacts with the human experience in that building. And so I would assume...
Look, it's a good example you make of the vernacular, actually, because in a way, when you look at those rural buildings, when we go back to how a lot of them were made, they're made in a very unself-conscious way, right? People are just making a barn, they're making a farmhouse, they're making a shelter in a way that is somehow just natural. Right? It's almost thoughtless. And it's done in a way that makes a connection to the land, to the purpose of what they're building, and to the choice of materials. It's unself-conscious and transparent. And then the processes that you began to talk about, which now dominate the production of building almost across the world, are the ones that actually are reductive, that take that naturalness away, that introduce a whole lot of process, which are purely about reducing costs, doing things in the most pragmatic and in a way industrialized, institutionalized way, that robs the architecture of its meaning and ultimately, strips it of that essential quality. And then perhaps what happens is it's plastered on in a very superficial way, which makes us think that it has some value, but actually it's even worse, right? And that is the process of alienation that pretty much all of us have been subjected to.
So there's two things in there. One of the things I've always noticed is these buildings that are left over from a bygone era seem to be whoever constructed them seemed to have a much better grasp of proportions than the common buildings today. And I'm just assuming that these buildings, farmhouses, barns that are left over, were the common buildings of the day then that just survived. Now, did they actually have a better sense of proportion and understanding of materials, what they mean, how they work, and the vernacular and the feeling of the area? Did they just more intrinsically understand that and communicate that through what they built? Or are those simply the buildings that were really beautiful then, and because of their beauty were they kept around and maintained? Did they have a bunch of crappy buildings back then that just didn't last? And this is my struggle with the past of these beautiful older vernacular buildings of New England that I really love. Were they better builders back then and better designers just naturally? Because one idea in my mind, and hopefully this rambling thing you can pull some useful things out of, but were people back then required to do more themselves? So in doing more themselves, they gain more understanding and wisdom of the wide expanse of life in general that is then communicated through what they actually built, where today we have refined what we do down to very niche things, and then like our value we put into this very narrow lane, if you will. Like, I only take photographs or video. I don't have to do a lot of other things. So maybe I'm not getting enough experience to then tell me about design and everything else. I have a design background, so I kind of cheated there and went to school. But if I was only doing this one thing for value and then paying someone to do everything else, would I have less of an understanding of the totality of what I'm doing and how it communicates my existence and how I live? And do you understand what I'm rambling on about?
I do. And I think that my view is that this kind of schism we're talking about is one that came with modernism, came with modernity, right? Came with the very processes that have disconnected us and alienated us from the land, from our place, actually. We've become these kind of globalized, process-driven individuals, disconnected from community, disconnected from our culture, disconnected from our land. So when we come to a question of how do we build, then we kind of are very self-conscious about it. And we are also very regulated and defined by all the processes that surround the realization of a building. When we're thinking about vernacular architecture, when we're stepping back not very far, actually,
yeah,
none of those questions come up, right? we're connected to this land, we're building in this place, and we don't think self-consciously about it. We actually build in the way that our ancestors, right, our predecessors, have built. Thing change was very, very slow, and the processes around it, which is the material choices, the production processes, are very limited. Right? So you're dealing with something that is unself-conscious, almost intuitive, and that's limited and essentially connected to its place and its culture already. Right? Now we sit back, and it's an intellectualized process. If you're lucky, right? If you're unlucky, more often it just happens in the most.
Right. It can happen states, or you guys don't have states. You have provinces, or is that just
we
Canada?
have states, actually. We have
you
states.
do? Okay.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Good
Not
for
as
you.
many as you, but
It's not about how many. It's about
Yeah.
but yeah. So I mean, your house could be made a long ways away and shipped on the back of a 18-wheeler, and have no relationship to the land or the orientation or anything else.
Yeah,
It
that's
just
right.
it just arrives one day.
You know, there's a little story by Adolf Loos, Viennese architect, who describes, it's beautifully written, he describes a beautiful scene by a lake and a forest, and there's a village, right? And he says everything is at one, right? Everything is kind of natural and peaceful. It's a serene experience, it's a serene landscape. All of these things seem like one. And then over here, and what just catches his eye is a villa, right? And what he says is that serenity is lost, right, by the presence of the villa at the lake. And he says it doesn't matter whether the work is that of a good or a bad architect, right? That oneness, that interconnection, has been spoiled. And in a sense, that I think that is what he's getting at, this very thing that we're talking about.
Now, in a way, I disagree with someone who's probably far superior to my accomplishments in every way, but how does he explain that? Why is it a symbiosis that is lost in that moment of everything being one and being interrupted by the villa? Like, what is his explanation and thought process on that being an intrusion in that environment?
Well, I think it's that very point that the villa is the work of a kind of alienated modern humanity, right, that has lost its connection to a place. And that is a reality, all of us, right? We're all like that. I mean, I was,
Right.
I live here, I was actually born somewhere else. My connection to a place is tenuous. And we celebrate our globalized existence now. Most, the United States was basically all settled in a modern period. If you think about First Nations people, Native Americans, or Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, this is a culture that is deeply and spiritually connected to a place, and you rob those people of their land, you push them off their land, you affect them in a way that we're not affected by. We think about land as something we own, something instrumental, something to be used. We don't really think about it as something kind of more poetic, more spiritual, and more sustaining. Perhaps now we're beginning to realize that we're in a much more sensitive symbiotic relationship with the landscape, with the natural world. But basically, we've come out of a modern period where we treat nature in an instrumental, exploitative way, right? And that tends to be our cultural dominant, and that is what causes this great problem for us. And for us, how do we now think about it? Because you can never go back. It's lost, right?
Yeah.
So now we have to find a new way to make an authentic connection.
Right. So it's not. So would it be correct in receiving what you said in comparing the villa on the pond, that villa could be part of that oneness were it done or designed and built as architecture for this place? Is that a possibility in your mind and in Adolf's find. I hate saying the name Adolf without a last name.
Don't you?
Not
yeah,
Hitler.
It's terrible. Loos. Let's just call him Loos.
Loos.
Yeah.
Loos.
Well, I think, to answer your question from my perspective, I think this is one of the greatest challenges we face in contemporary architecture. And one of the, it's perhaps an overused word, authenticity, but I think it is something to strive for, that we need to design buildings, we need to make architecture, and we need to make our intrusions and adjustments to place in a way that are authentic. And one proposition, one reference I make at some point in one of these essays is about the work of, for example, Mies van der Rohe, and his villa that sits apart from the landscape. It sits up, and it just lets the landscape flow around it. Right? And in a way, this is the Farnsworth House I'm talking about. So mid 20th century building, and the proposition there is that this is a modern work, right, that sits separate from the landscape in order to not destroy the landscape. Right? So in a way, it's a recognition that we can no longer make the same kind of connection, the same kind of authenticity, that same sort of vernacular, unself-conscious work. Now it is self-conscious, but perhaps the first step is to not cause damage, and to sit apart from it and to suspend us in a way that we can begin to develop an understanding with landscape. And that is one step, and that is sort of one interpretation of late 20th century. I think we can go further than that, is my view. But we've got to be really wary of a reductionist approach, that we actually pay lip service, that we, for example, we make things look like the shape of a vernacular building. We just do something that superficially looks that way and think that we have created that connection, because we've actually done the complete opposite by doing it.
So, okay, you're getting me thinking. All right, I'm gonna mull that over. It's gonna come back up a little later. I don't want to jump the gun, but let's move on to your definition of truth. How do you understand truth? And there's also, I found that there's a complicated relationship between the definition of truth and the definition of fact. Not as much the current cultural, everyone has their own facts thing, but a fact is an extremely objective thing within our reality, and truth to me seems to be a quality of a thing that you have an ability to understand only through relating to it. And in your writing and understanding architecture and relating it and looking at it through truth, or if architecture can tell us about truth, what is your definition of truth?
Okay, well, thank you for that. And there's some good observations in that question. I put forward this concept of truth and lies in architecture as a way of trying to explore actually the very nature of your question. And it's a very difficult one. So, at one point there you referred to this sort of relativity about truth and facts. And of course, the reality is that we're now operating in an environment whereby opinion and fact are very difficult to distinguish. And that we actually tend to distort fact through our media, through basically popularity, number of hits, through assertiveness, that our grip actually on what is a fact is very, very weak now, probably one of its weakest. And this is an overall environment which makes these questions even more difficult. And when we think about truth, you're right, it is different. If we could even come at an agreement on what is a fact, and you would like to think we could, the sun will rise. Right? This is not, no matter how many opinions we get to the otherwise, it will. That there might be a basic fact there. That when we think about truth, that is something a little more difficult, a little more driven by values, I think. And what the question I ask is, what is architecture's relationship to truth? Right? Can architecture indeed tell any truths? Right? Is it a completely redundant term in relation to architecture? And
in what way could architecture illuminate truth or tell a truth?
That's right. And what is the nature of that truth? Exactly right.
Right.
So if we think about, in the essay in the book, Truth and Lies, or I think it's The Truth of Architecture and the Lies of the Architect, I
like
explore.
I'm really gonna have to get this book now. I'm liking all the embedded contradictions that seem to come out as not contradicting, just from the beginning of this conversation. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. One of the essays, speaking of contradiction, is called True and Not True, which explores this idea: can something be true and not true at the same time? And it's quite an interesting philosophical scientific research on that very issue. But the proposition is, what truths can architecture tell? And we know, for example, if we think about the modern period, there was an idea that architecture did have some kind of moral purpose. And I think throughout the history of architecture, there has been that idea that architecture is associated with values, with a kind of moral kind of virtue or otherwise. And we've seen that a lot in that proposition. Architects talk about truth to materials. We've seen buildings attempting to represent certain ideas. We saw that, for example, we've seen that right through the kind of classical period. We've seen it actually in various regimes that have come in, whatever they may be, whether they're Soviet regimes, Nazi regimes, or whether they're Western. We see an idea about architecture. But also, if you look at the history of architecture, you can see that architecture is in many ways transparent to that. That actually, if you think about classical architecture has had such a long history that the associations of its use and its meaning have almost been washed out of it. That it's used, so it can be used, it's used for Christian religious purposes just as much as it's used for pagan purposes. In history, it's used for a symbol of democracy in Washington, right? And it was used by Adolf Speer to represent the values of fascism, or indeed in communism. We see classical architecture being a kind of free-for-all, in a sense. It's almost an idea that it has been robbed of any associated meaning, and you can use it for whichever purpose you want.
Now, a statement or question there: is classical architecture something that got at a truth so deep that it can be used by any ideology because of the base of how deep they pulled from to create these relationships of what has become essentially just a color by numbers design book? You can do that with classical architecture and get every time a good looking building. You can do that. It's just not hard. It's a recipe book. I don't have anything against classical architecture. I just don't think my personal opinion is that I don't think we need to keep building it. I think we need to progress, but that's my personality. I understand that, and that's fine. But is there any potential in that, in your thinking, that classical architecture pulled from something so deep that it is then able to be used by anything to express their ideas of how they manipulate a deeper truth, potentially?
Yeah, and indeed that is a great question, which I do explore a little bit. That the idea that classical architecture, because of its inherent relationship to, I guess, our lives and human proportions and so on, and because of the fact that it's been used over thousands and thousands of years, that perhaps it has developed a certain autonomy, if we put it that way. And this is this whole question of the autonomy of architecture, that actually architecture is something into itself, and there's something more essential in its relationship to humanity. And that, maybe that was part of the thinking and the work of people like Aldo Rossi and so on. and we keep building classical architecture. Absolutely, we keep going. But what I also suggest is that I don't think that really holds true, because if we go beyond a Western history, right? If we for example, if we look at Native Americans, if we look at Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, we look at some more indigenous cultures, then classical architecture is a very powerful representation of oppression, right? And does not relate to ways of being which are actually more fluid, which are actually more directly connected to nature. And it's like if you put people who are connected with nature inside those classical boxes, it is going to be a deeply disturbing and alienating experience for them. So I suggest that architecture is never mute in that way. And the other thing I suggest is that architecture is never innocent. That we whatever goes on in these buildings, right, will affect them, right? That whether it's good or bad, whether the deeds behind these doors are abhorrent or inspiring, that will affect the architecture. It will affect our association, and that is why ultimately, some of these buildings need to be preserved and remembered, and some of them need to be pulled down. That connection between our lives, our values, our culture, and architecture is close, ultimately, whether we want it to be or not. So I'm against that idea of autonomy.
Now, could classical architecture be considered indigenous architecture of Greece at that period of time then? Is that a fair assumption of that, or?
I think so. Yes, I think if you look at the origins of classical architecture, then it goes back to a real essential building of a vernacular, and you see that in a lot of the theorizing around architecture, and what you're dealing with is a transformation of something really quite basic and in a way very vernacular through almost a process of evolution, right, over generations of hundreds and thousands of years, into something which is then highly rarefied and kind of intellectual, but ultimately did have that connection. But you're right, it's a connection to a certain locale.
Right. Yeah, and in that place it was indigenous or original to that geographic location of the people of that time, who probably unseated some other people that were there before them. This is always a difficult thing for me to know how to hold. It's a hot potato, so it's like, what do you do with it? But it's like, how long until the current architecture that we're doing around the world and in each geographic location becomes indigenous over time, and then someone else is going to come along and move this out, and this will come in, and then 1,000 years from now, there'll be the same kind of conversation about what we established wherever and whoever we are. Then again, it becomes another rolling over of this. Let's respect what we would then call First Nations people 1,000 years from now, but the conversation always continues further back. Well, if you think about it, those Americans, they were not First Nations people. It was the Native Americans, and then the Native Americans have this ability to say between themselves, the Navajo were first. No, we were first, and it's a hard conversation, and it's a hard understanding of what is truly right, because is there a culture that doesn't have blood on its hands that would not eventually have its architecture be viewed as something of an oppressive vernacular or an oppressive language of architecture to someone else, right? That's just an odd cultural conversation in my head that I don't know how to relate to.
I think that what's happened at a certain period is that evolution of architecture in relation to a particular locale and culture is broken, right? And that whole ability for evolution to work, and also in reality, evolution is being completely disrupted by the triumph of humanity. You know, we are so powerful now that the whole our control over our environment is so complete almost that it's interrupted those processes of evolution.
Yeah, it's like we're becoming a consciously evolving rather than biologically.
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings into play another thing which I think is really interesting, which is this idea of consciousness and technology. You know, that we've and the idea now that evolution is actually been completely bent and distorted by technology, and that our pathway as humans to evolutionary process is now not so much the Darwinian model anymore, but is the intervention of our technology, which of course you could think, where's the gap? Which is where this question of consciousness, you know, how far does consciousness extend beyond our own human limits, comes into play, right? Which is slightly another issue, but a really interesting one, which also is the subject of one of those essays in there, and why there is that image on the cover of the book, actually.
I love that cover.
Yeah, which is because I find that really interesting. It's this question of consciousness and representation. So I guess what I was getting, I get slightly distracted there, but so what I'm suggesting to you is that at some point that connection has been broken, and now we are self-conscious that actually it can't just happen naturally, that architecture can't evolve in the way that it did with classical architecture, for example, or the slow multi-generational evolutionary of vernacular or an indigenous architecture. That it's so much faster now, that technology, speed, and I think the production processes around architecture are so complex, right, and powerful that they disconnect us from that process. That no longer happens. So the turnover now is so quick, right? And you know, the extreme is Instagram, right? That you know, we now consume architecture as a series of images in a fleeting fraction of a second, right? Yeah. And you know, and then we want the next one, right? And then we move on to the next one, and we're expecting now something to change because we're a bit bored of it. We want to go to the next one. We're a bit over arches now. We want to go to something else, whatever it is. Right. And we kind of consume architecture that way. Now that was never the case before we experienced architecture. That it was, we actually had to go. We had to live in it. We had to get connected with it. So those processes have changed, and I think it is very difficult now to create those relationships of any depth and of any substance. I think that's a challenge, you know, and that's one of the things that make it very, very difficult for us.
Yeah, we have such an immense ability of information, just absolutely absurd, instantaneous connection to every other single human on the earth, practically. And we've become far more of a hive mind now than these far more controlled gatekeepers of information like we had just 10 years ago, hardly, 10, 15 That's years right. ago. And there seems to be such an incredible power there. It's like we've discovered fire again. And if it's out of control, it'll burn the whole house down. But it's one of the most valuable things we've ever discovered, fire. And the same with the sun. It'll burn you to a crisp, but it's also going to give you life. And there's these discussions of, flee from technology and run to the woods. And I don't think that's the answer. I think it's face it, experience it, and learn how to interact with it wisely. Because we're far more intelligent than we are wise, because we can have every bit of information we want, but it's still, we're limited in experience. And it's only experience with knowledge that gives you wisdom. And to have all this intelligence and ability and hardly any wisdom to speak of, we're just going to run it into ground. We're not going to be any different than lionfish that are taking over the eastern seaboard. They have no natural predators, and they go wild. Humans are essentially an invasive species, not because of where we're at and that we're out of control because we don't have predators as much as our intelligence makes us able to be the absolute top thing with no other predator other than ourselves. And we're going to take ourselves out if we're not wise about it. So that I really appreciate the look into this in your book and the subject matters that you're bringing up. I think it's really interesting. To move on, so we don't go on forever, but I really love the distracted conversation of artificial consciousness and everything else. But we'll try and stay on track. What's your definition of beauty? How do we experience and know what is beautiful? Is beauty only a subjective thing, or is beauty something that can be objective, in your opinion?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that there's a yes and no answer to that one.
One of these paradoxes.
Yeah, it is. It's a paradox, right? Because one of the issues we face in our globalized existence is relativity, cultural relativity, relative values through the world, is a respect for cultures. And a recognition that our tendency, the modernist tendency, right, the globalized tendency, is to crush difference, right? To be intolerant of it. Even if that's not our value, even if we don't consciously do that, and we do it a lot, but even if we don't, we will do it just through being alienated modern individuals with all of the commercial processes that we bring along. Will crush cultural difference. But what I think we realise is that in doing that, we lose something really vital, and we see that in the natural world too. If you see it in the extinction of animal life and plant life, just through all of our processes of inhabiting this world at the moment, we are crushing it. We're crushing that difference, and then what we realise is that with that extinction, we will lose food sources, we'll use medical innovations, we'll use resources, we will destroy things before we've even discovered them. That biodiversity is absolutely fundamental to our continued life and existence, just as our cultural biodiversity is really fundamental to our ability to grow and develop as humans, and to address the very challenges that you've just put to us, right? That are this question of wisdom, right? Because the most important bit of wisdom you've got to have is realizing what you don't know, right?
Right.
And how risky it is to act with ignorance, right? So you've got this one question, which is this relative question, that we've got to be respectful of difference and we've got to understand it. At the same time, I think we've got to recognise that, notwithstanding that, there is also something deeply fundamental about being a human being that connects all of us, connects all of those cultures, and even the ones that seem impossible to connect. We are all people. We have children. We want a better life for the next generation. We want to look after the world in a way. There's something really fundamental about our relationship to this earth, and that if we are too focused on difference and relativism, we will actually miss what is the most important thing, which is actually what will connect those cultures, and it's only that's going to save us from killing each other. Right? So you have these two truths in a way, which can seem incongruous, right? And I think it's that's where, of course, paradox perhaps is the truest place we could be. That ability to be able to see both.
Yeah, that idea of paradox is similar to having conflicted emotions. Emotions will naturally make you biased in decision making or even predicting things or how you react to things. But when you have conflicting emotions, you are more accurate in your predictions. This is coming from a NPR, I think it was a Hidden Brain episode about conflicting emotions. And some of the studies they've done, I'm sure I'm botching this in some way, but everyone go listen to it yourself if you like it. But conflicting emotions help a person or cause a person to seek more outside advice, and also to be able to make predictions far more accurately. and have less bias because they're not, in a sense, being a victim of their own emotions, pushing them to one choice rather than fairly considering the multiple choices that are always in front of you. And that idea of paradox, I think, is a similar thing, where you can kind of see this is right and this is right, but they make each other not right. What's going on? It makes you, in that same moment, kind of say, we're missing a piece of the puzzle here. And that's a good thing, to embrace that paradox and to dig deeper in it, rather than to just squash one side of the paradox and say, we're just going to go with this side and just ignore that or kill it or whatever. So
that is absolutely right, and it's becoming very, very difficult to inhabit that space that you just talk about, because our world is so polarized, right? That you're here or you're there, right? You're for or you're against, and it's very difficult. And I realize there's a great comfort in one of those poles, right? It's the sort of deceit of certainty. It gives you perhaps a really artificial sense of security and knowing, which unfortunately is entirely false, because everything is in the grey. If the truth is anywhere, it's in the grey.
Right, it's in the tension between the poles, and that right. To me, the natural position of the polarization is one of conscientiousness, following what is established, and openness, seeking to better what we have established. And you have the dissection of the separation of the American political system. You've got your conservatives, the conscientious, and your liberals. You're far more open. And it's odd. They both seem to think that they're singularly right, and they do not give the grace to say, I need your perspective to improve this thing. And the other side doesn't have the ability to say, we need to respect to some degree what is established, because it's what offers us our safety and our ability to rejuvenate ourselves before we go back out and try and figure out how to do and improve more things. And without these two working together, it's as bad as if men and women became polarized and no one was mating to make more kids. It's that intrinsic in our biology, that we have these different dispositions of maintain what's established and improve what's established and discover more. Those two dispositions, if they are not married and working properly, descend into ultimate chaos and a loss of what we have been able to establish. And it's the open side that's always, coming back and saying, we haven't been respectful, we need to improve that, we need to improve this. And like even kind of an emotion you could take away from a critical approach to the built environment is that a more conscientious person might say, you're trying to make me feel bad about what I've built. And that is not what's being said. What's being said is we need to be careful about this. It's not that you're bad, we've just have so much power and are making such an incredible impact on everything because of our ability, that we need to be more careful about this. We need to rethink it and improve what we're doing and make that an established thing for a time until we can make a better establishment. And we have to constantly be working on that establishment. So, me running off topic there, sorry.
That's all right. It's there is a essay in my book called Bridges of Labab, I think it is, which is and Labab is an invert of the word Babel, right? And it is about this question. So I start by looking at the Tower of Babel, right? And which was an act of unified humanity to connect us with God, right?
Right.
But God struck it down, right? And made our language multiple, right, and spread us around the world, right? So we could no longer do that. So, in a sense, our mission, I think, is, and related to the question you're asking, is to reassemble these fragments that have been disconnected and spread, but keep them whole, right? But bring them into some new assembly, right? and not one of exclusion, not one that actually crushes difference, but one that can embrace it into a more unified kind of cultural and social concept. And that is not classicism. That is the, in a sense, it's not the inverse of it. It's just not that singularity. No, it's not unity at the expense of difference.
Right. So this leads me to my next question. In this metaphorical story of the Tower of Babel, or literal true story of the Tower of Babel, or somewhere in between, there's a lesson to be learned from people working together to reach, to be safe on their own, I think was the idea of building the Tower of Babel so a flood could not get them. I'm not a theologian, I'm just a hobbyist, but in that thing, there's in that whole story, there's metaphorical meaning and a lot going on there, but all of that kind of hinges on what a person understands God to be. So in your thinking, being the author of this book, who's thought a lot to be able to make a book, what is your definition of God?
Gosh, well, what an interview.
Sorry, it's where I go.
Well, I think that it's very difficult to define that, and I use that story as a point of dealing with this very question we're talking about of unity and something that brings humanity together, but also how do we deal with the fact that we're actually so diverse, and how do we not crush us? So, and of course, it's connected with how do we actually have a community without crushing the individual? And that's an incredible balance to deal with. The question of, so of course, the purpose of the tower was actually to get to heaven, right? Which made a lot of sense, right? It's a bit literal and it's impossible because heaven isn't really like that. And I think if I would extend that analogy, God isn't really like that either. And that God is such a difficult and loose concept that humanity has used for so many different purposes that it becomes difficult to assign a particular meaning to it. I think that the concept of God is really something that connects us beyond our existence. It's really a search for something within us which connects us in a way that we don't really experience. Right? It's a kind of drive for an interconnectedness, and I don't actually think it's just between human beings. I think it's with the whole world. It's a bit like, it's a bit like the experience and the concept of the sublime, if I put it that way. That if you go to the Grand Canyon, for example, I remember my first visit there, it was like mind-blowing. Or if you sit at the edge of the ocean, or if you're in a forest, and you can have an overwhelming feeling of connection, right? Where your individuality, the thing that particularly in the 21st century we are so obsessed with, seems to just ebb away, right? That you're no longer an individual. You feel kind of connected, and in a way, the concept of the sublime is huge, right? It's this huge experience of nature that makes you as an individual feel small, but it feels good to be small, right? You feel
the death
connected.
of ego in a way.
Exactly, and that then I think is the concept of God.
Yes, I can be
you escape
supportive
yourself,
of that.
right? You can.
Yes.
The thing that the biggest burden we carry around, right, is this invention of who we are, right, and it's a huge burden to carry. Is this constant invention of who we are, and today in a kind of modern globalized world where you can be anything, right? You can be absolutely anything you want. So now you didn't used to be like that. Previously, you used to be a farmer, and your mum and dad were farmers, and you were going to be a farmer. It was really clear. Your life was clear. Now it's not. Now you can be anything you want, and so you have to decide what you're going to do, and it's your identity then becomes a huge project for you. And now, of course, because your identity is now arguably more virtual than real, it's even more concentrated, right? So your whole life is your obsession with your identity, and it's perhaps the escape of that is what we might think of as a term which I struggle with. God, I think it's not so useful because it's such a powerful kind of association with it, which makes it difficult to escape all of that.
Yeah, there's two things there. So this idea of the Tower of Babel in modern times, it seems like you could almost adjust the metaphor, the story, the factual retelling, whatever it is, to the Tower of Babel actually being individuals in today's society, where we are constantly trying to build something that is indestructible, that keeps us safe, that reaches for God as a self-centered thing. And when you do that, it all comes crumbling down eventually if it's self-centered. And I wonder if there's some kind of deeper connection in that story to our culture today that is one that has lost community being a large focus of that culture, and far more an individualistic culture, to where we don't as much together as much in past times strive to create things between us that protect us and raise the God, but we're kind of lost in this virtual reality and everything else of us making towers of Babel of ourselves. I wonder, that's an unpolished thought there, but
but I think there's something in that, because if so, what I suggest is that the tower form itself, right, in a way is an absolute expression of what you're talking about. It's incredibly singular, right? It is almost in itself figure. It almost looks like one person, right? We're trying to drive everything together and reach to the skies, right? And it's so powerful. We're obsessed with it, right? Architects are kind of obsessed with towers, right? It's almost been the pinnacle, in a way, of what we're all supposed to do is build a tower, right? And humanity generally. And so, in a way, the suggestion is it's wrong. And what I the dialectic I throw against it is actually the bridge. So it's the bridge of Labab as opposed to the Tower of Babel, and so it's the metaphor is connection, right, and something which is in some ways tenuous, more horizontal, and more pulls us together. I mean, so in another essay, actually, in this book called The Fall of the Architect, I talk about the tower. It's a slightly strange essay in a way, but it's about, I talk about high place syndrome, right, which is the kind of call of the void, where, you have that experience where you go towards the edge, for example, of a tall building or a cliff, and you feel the draw of the void, right? You feel a temptation to step out. It's a natural syndrome we have. I think something like 60% or 40% of us actually have that sense that we want to jump, right? And anyway, I explore that a little bit and how it kind of relates to architecture. But in a way, what I'm suggesting is the tower itself is an alienating form. It disconnects us with the ground. It pulls us together in a way which is artificial, and that maybe that intuition to jump is actually a kind of reflection of something we need to do. Not jump, don't get me wrong, but connect to the ground and connect to each other.
Yeah, because it's an extremely metaphorical stretch, but that's where when you're this advanced, you have to reach pretty far to understand where all this came from and why we have it.
That's right.
And, because it's an absurd thing, I get that all the time when I'm on top of a building. It's like, don't jump. I'm saying that to myself, and I'm not depressed. I love my family. I love my life. I do not want to die, but I have to tell myself that would be a lot of fun until you hit that ground, And is it something that's like you're up above everything, you're at the pinnacle of it, and there's nowhere to go but down from here, so jump, or I don't know. Again, kind of an unpolished thought, but there's definitely something there, and I wonder.
There is something there. That's exactly right. There is something there in that feeling which we have. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing that came out of this last question is that I've been, as a hobby, trying to understand God for the last decade, trying to come up with a definition that's suitable. And in reading, over this, it's a bit of a reoccurring thing, at least with Tower of Babel. But this idea, the deepest I can get on it, is this idea of truth and relationship. Relationship's a better word than love in my estimation, but love is a broader term, but it often in humans conjures up, I mean, we're the only ones who use the word, so okay. But in people, we understand love to be a romantic thing. I understand love to be a relationship, not a feeling, but a relationship. And this idea of truth and relationship are the most foundational things that I can come to, that I can see the relationship of relating and truth. You have consciousness, the ability to relate what is true outside of us or between us, the things. So that this idea of there is truth, and the only way you can understand what that truth is to relate to it. And that seems to go all the way down to the atomic level and beyond in things like electrons are the most subjective thing. They're everywhere and nowhere, and yet they're bound to this nucleus. And if you break that relationship, there's a really strong reaction that goes up the chain in a disastrous way. And that's been a really interesting thing for me to translate in my head. When people say God, what I translate it to mean is truth and relationship. And to add to that, I'll say to myself, truth and love in an honest and selfless manner, because there's no other way to understand truth than through relating to it. And if you're reading about someone else's relating to it and figuring out what is true and conveying it to you, that's still truth from a relationship. And I haven't found a way to get to a more foundational or deeper level of understanding of what people say is God. And if a person allows themselves to come up with a definition of God that is one of a graven image of the mind, that is a anthropomorphization of themselves into what they want God to be, well, then that just becomes a tool for you to build your ego in accordance to what you believe God to be. So to strip all that away and say it is simply God is both truth and love, or truth and love interacting. And that is manifested within the bell curve of masculine and feminine. And it's the process of objectification and subjectification. It's nominalization and denominalization. It's the ebb and flow of everything, and the balancing effect. So, side note, Anna.
Well, interesting thoughts you have there, and one of the ways in which I'm suggesting we can think about God is in the way we can escape ourselves, right, and the burden of being who we are. And if we think about for example, Michelangelo, he said that when he is making, his art was not by him, right? It was from God through him, right? And he didn't make these decisions. It was flowing through him. He was an instrument, right, for this creativity. Right. And we all know the feeling of being in the flow, right? Being in that space when you're not self-conscious anymore. And I think perhaps if I reflect on some of the questions you've asked, and we go back to what's a way forward, right? It is in that space. I mean, there's a bit of there's an essay in my book about architectural theory, and which I have a lot of respect for and time for. But what I also say is that theory is it doesn't help practice, right? It's actually an impediment to practice. It's a good impediment, right? But the only way that in the world that we exist in, with all of its complexity and all of its demands and all of its limitations and all the pressures you come under as a designer, that the only way we can respond to the pressing cultural and social issues is actually through intuition. Right? It is through putting all of this aside. It can't be self-conscious, is what I'm saying. That if you can just be open, to use the expression you were using a moment ago, if you can actually step aside, step out of yourself for a moment, if you can just step into the work, right? If you can get in the flow, then maybe that is a way forward.
Oh, I get what you're saying. Your architectural theory would, for me, would be reading it from a book and trying to, in my experience, bring in what someone else has discovered and make me push it through that cheese grater, essentially, to create something. Where what you're saying is if you use your intuitive abilities of perception within the moment of experience and are honest with yourself, see, that to me is that definition of God. That being very present in relating to what is. And it's in that moment where self dissolves away, and there's something about an extremely, if you can control it, there's something about a very emotional state. If you can allow yourself to be in a very emotional state while still maintaining an articulate brain state rather than an emotional control of your actions and words, if you can be present and observe high emotion while being to articulate and think, you become perceptive at a very highly effective level. And I've seen it in different speakers and felt it in my own experience. Like a lot of times if I'm thinking about some of these type of subjects, I'll listen to a song over and over and over while processing these things, and I'll find that the emotion of that song allows me to be far more perceptive in that moment. But there's a limited amount of times that song can cause that emotion in me. It wears off. Like it becomes repetitive after a spell of time, and I don't get the same thing from it. It does not allow me to be as perceptive as the first, 50 times I listened to it while writing or thinking or working things out. And it's such an odd thing for me to realize that, and it also leaves me looking for music that allows me that emotional presence. And I use it as a tool when I'm thinking. It's a very odd thing that I've never fully processed. But I have, let's see, I think 5 remaining statements from the summary of your book that I went over. You answered one of them about architectural practice or theory. So there's only 5 remaining. But so you had this statement that any building that damages and undermines our symbiosis with the natural world is not architecture. And let me see if I can answer that as if you're telling me, because I think you told me, but I want to know that I'm actually learning this. So like this example of the villa on this setting of oneness around a pond, this villa is not architecture if it is not fully respectful and present and accommodating of the entirety of the situation around that setting. A poetic process of building and relating to that setting is what architecture would be.
Yes, that's right. And the quote that you read there was from an essay in there, I think called "The Extinction of the Architect," which explores the challenge of sustainability and climate change, and what the obligation of architecture is to us. And one of the points I'm making in there is that architecture is not measurable. It's not a bunch of numbers. It's not just simply an analysis, and that a risk that we face in our profession is that we reduce the question of sustainability simply to a number process. That actually we try to let's have zero carbon. Let's have it's completely minimised embodied energy. Let's bring the whole thing right down, and a whole bunch of engineers can help us with this, and then we will reach a sustainable architecture. And what I suggest is that of course that's extremely important, in fact essential, but it goes a bit deeper than that, and that if we are really going to develop a symbiotic and balanced relationship with our world, with the natural world and everything it has, then architecture in its poetic content will also have to create that symbiosis that we experience and we feel. And so that is the context of that comment.
It seems like we have to admit to ourselves that we are exceedingly powerful, exceedingly capable, and are a danger to ourselves if we're not aware of how powerful we are and how intensely respectful and thoughtful we need to be within the environments that we overlay our will and our power. I mean, we're so effective at spreading our will around the globe if we're not conscious enough to understand what we're doing. If we're just a bumbling along lionfish, eliminating all the other marine life in an ecosystem that we're completely out of, we're not going to have anything to eat eventually, and then we'll kill everything else, and then we'll die, and that's not a good look. So my second statement here that I wanted to go over was architectural theory, but I believe you answered that very clearly, so thank you for that. And actually, you went over talking about building tall. Perhaps it is the metaphoric human reach and the Tower of Babel, and we covered that. So actually, we only have 4 questions. Architectural education. This one was interesting to me. Architectural education, negatively, is born of our training, and in particular the predominance of the negative critique in our schools of architecture. The negative critique seems to be a foundation of the education of the architect, reaching a focus in the jury, criticism of major projects, often with external jurors, where the student is expected to present and then defend the proposition. The language seems needlessly negative and combative, more suited to the courtroom setting and trial of an accused. Now, my wife would strongly agree with you here. Being trained as an architect, I'm often very negative and very critical in my approach to everything. What is your take on architectural education, and what are you outlining and what are you proposing in your opinion, in your thought process?
Well, what I'm getting at there is, and that I think that's from one of those essays, which is about melancholy, the melancholy of the architect, something like that, where I do talk about why are architects the way we are? Why are we actually so critical? Why actually are we so critical of each other? Right? It's a deeply competitive and negative culture that has evolved around our profession, and of course, having gone through architectural education and teaching, I think that one of the problems is that architecture, we are trained to put forward concepts and defend them, right, and then to defend them in an environment where they're actually being attacked, right, and it's almost a cliche. You think of Ayn Rand, Howard Roark, Frank Lloyd Wright. As an architect, you are meant to know the truth, right? You've got this truth, and you are going to pound away at it, and you are going to realise that. And the greatest quality you need is a sense of absolute determination, right? And my concern is that these kind of cultural norms that have seeped into our profession, not entirely. I mean, our architects are also inherently generous, and I'm saying that you would expect us to be, right? You would actually expect us to be deeply collaborative, deeply community focused, because our art form has to involve hundreds of people, and and other people pay for it, right? And other people build it. So really, we have to be like this. But our training does seem to contradict that, and I worry that what we are producing through this process of a negative critique is exactly the architects that we don't need. And I worry that we crush and exclude the very ones we do need. And sometimes I think, how many would-be architects have left because they cannot cope with that degree of critique, and what comes out of that training. And I think the very qualities we need to address the issues that we've been talking about, and that I try to explore, are, if we're not careful, pushed out of us in the training of the architect.
Right. I can easily gravitate towards a response to that is one of, capitalism, competition, survival, and these are all very very combative and striving words and thoughts around, that's life. That what else do you want us to do? But the idea, some people think of any hierarchical structure as being one of dominance and oppression. And the interesting thing is that in chimpanzee hierarchical structures, the ones who are at the top, who get there by force and violence, they have a short reign, and as soon as their back is turned, the others, 2 or 3 other, moderately strong chimps will take them out. Now, the effective chimps that get to the top of that hierarchical structure, that stay in power for the longest, are actually ones that are extremely cooperative. And the ones that get to the top of the hierarchical structure actually spend the most time grooming all the other chimps. And I mean by picking bugs off and eating them, whatever they do for grooming. This idea of community and empowerment to all of those who you've been entrusted or nominated to lead. In that system, that chimp up there has been nominated. In the other system of hierarchy, that top chimp took the top position, and it will be taken from him as soon as the back is turned. And that's an interesting thing, that hierarchical structures or leadership structures, these things that we've had for eons, they don't have to be these controlling, oppressive things. They can be far more flattened out and community oriented in their distribution of responsibility. And the people that move up typically are actually in human hierarchical structures. A lot of time they're more hierarchical structures of competence rather than strength and power. When there's strength and power, they come crashing down in the most violent fashions. So it's a interesting take on that in my own experience, it's you make a proposal of here's my design, here's how I met the requirements, and you present it as best as you can to try and take away any ability for negative opinions and critical feedback. And the less critical polling you can get on it, the more successful that project is, and the better the grade you would get. I can't envision right now what a different structure of education would be like if it wasn't filtering out those who weren't competent in that way, but maybe there's a different way of understanding who's competent and how to assess that. I don't know.
I think it's an interesting question, that one, but I think you can begin by if you are critiquing a project, if you're a juror, critiquing a project, even if we accept that system, which I highly question, then you can look at a project and you can pull it apart and you can find out where it's weak, and you can explore that. Or you can do the opposite. You can actually find out where that project is strong. You can actually find in that project, underneath it somewhere, something really good, right? You can find a latent possibility in that project, and you can help the student find what they have perhaps unknowingly discovered. And even that mindset change, even in the same structure of the same system, in my view, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I need to learn how to embody that in many ways, because with my raising my kids, my wife is constantly raising our kids. My wife is constantly, she's saying, like, you always need to start with a soft startup. You need to start with like, let's outline what they're doing great before we talk about what they're doing wrong. And I constantly go right to the, like, this is wrong because of that. You need to do this, change that. My go-to is very negative, very critical, and I have to be very aware of that. I have to admit it to myself and make sure I'm not addressing these little guys with this, like you're outlining.
You must be an architect.
I was trained as an architect, yeah, but I haven't practiced since 2005 probably. So I'm a recovering
it's a challenge
architect.
for all of us, that. Yeah, right. That's a long process of recovery.
Yeah, and there's also something I've been toying with, thinking about, that there's this ability to know something, but the more intelligent people you are able to interact with, you realize that the really intelligent people realize how little they know, and the really unintelligent people think they know everything, and that's an odd thing. And when you get to a place of actually knowing something, you realize that you can't tell someone else what you know as a means of getting them to the position with everything that you have there. So you have to allow them to either experience to that point of knowing, or the best thing you can do is lead them to the place where you're at simply with questions, never a statement. And by framing questions to lead them to the same place, you're able to allow them to pave the road to that point of understanding. Again, an unpolished thought. Many unpolished thoughts today. Sorry about that.
They're the best ones.
Yeah, well, they create the longest conversations that go nowhere sometimes, but that's all right. That's what this is about, podcasts.
Yeah.
I think, let's see, the two last ones. Permanence. Architecture is not mere change. Architecture is more perpetual transformation towards permanence. It's more often about uncovering what it is in humanity that does not change. So transformation towards permanence. Architecture is not mere change. Architecture is more perpetual transformation towards permanence. Can you explain that to me so I could actually understand it?
Yeah, I think I'm not exactly sure where that line comes from, but there's an essay in there which is about time. And partly what I explore there is our obsession as architects with the idea of timelessness. Right? We often say that's one quality we're looking for in this building is that it's going to be timeless, and I explore the whole notion of time and architecture and culture, and how one of the things that we try to do is escape our mortality, right? Is to deal with our existential limits, that this is going to stop, right? And it's one of the biggest challenges we've got, and often architecture and cultural artifacts are pulled into that we try to make something, we try to look for permanence, right? And The other characteristic that we have, I think, as designers is we have enormous pressure on us to do something different, right? Well, that's gone, that's irrelevant.
Right.
The whole way we work now, our technology, everything is different, right? So it couldn't be more different, than how it was 100 years ago. Okay, we're doing this on screen, everything is virtual. Everything is different. So we need to change. We need constant change. But what you notice in that process is that actually, ironically, a lot of the people associated with some of these really new ways of working with high technology want to be in old buildings, right? Actually, they want to be in old buildings. And what you also notice is that while all of these things may change, there is so much which doesn't change about us, that we are, of course, we're exactly the same. That we want a view out a window, we want some fresh air, we want a space that protects us and nurtures us, but also allows us to experience difference and step out. We want in many things. What I'm suggesting is don't change, and within the intense pressure for change and innovation, it's really important to understand what doesn't change, and then in relation to the pursuit of timelessness. What I explore there are different ways in which architecture has responded to this, different ideas for how we can address this kind of threat, our mortality. How do we make an architecture that is going to stay, right? How can we do that? And it's very interesting to explore what various movements or theories in architecture have proposed. And one of the ones in which what I begin to suggest, I think, in that line is this idea that actually permanent evolution and change is, in fact, that way in which you are going to make something timeless. That it's actually, in a way, by accepting evolution and change, and by seeing architecture as in a less definitive way, as a more continuous way, is in a way more building on something that's gone before and something that's going to follow, right? That it's actually more of a contribution rather than a completion. It's something incomplete. Is a way in which we can conceive of architecture and perhaps respond to this challenge.
Yeah, when I hear someone say like, "Oh, that's a really timeless thing," what I interpret that to mean is, 20 years from now it'll still have an ambiguity to when it was created, in that people will still appreciate it even as styles change. This one is so good that it will still be around and still be relevant. And that's interesting in like what you said, that we're constantly like, well, you can't just do the same thing. Well, why not? It's effective. Why do we have this drive to actually do something different? Is that ego, or is that searching for creating something that could illuminate further truth while while covering the bases of the needs and the things that have been established, like boxes that we all know we need to check, but we want to do something new that might get closer to some truth that we don't yet know, and hence it's a little more timeless in that. That's kind of the things that rumble around in my head when I hear that. And that pretty much wraps up. We covered from different angles everything that I wanted to talk about there. So I really appreciate you getting up at probably 4 a.m. Australia time to make
Actually, it's not that bad. It was 7 a.m., but it wasn't that bad.
Okay, good. So what time is it there currently?
It is now almost 8:30.
Oh, okay, not too bad. So it's 6:30 here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've been going for quite a while. I really appreciate taking up a lot of your morning.
No,
I hope you have
it's been a pleasure talking to you, Trent. Really, really great to talk to you. Yeah. So I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for writing this book. I'm going to have to get a copy. I love things that I can get a start to finish multiple times in a digestible format, and the connectivity between them all being something that's philosophical and design oriented is right up my alley. So I haven't read it yet, but I think I'm actually going to. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for taking all the time to put this thought in and caring enough to put this down on paper and clarify your thoughts to the rest of us. Thank you for coming on and clarifying these things to me. Really appreciate it, and I'm excited to check this book out. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. I hope you enjoy it.